All right, so we've got the basics of routing with UI Router down. One thing we didn't talk about yet, though, is how to use controllers with UI Router. So we've got our classifieds controllers set up here, and we use it in our existing view by placing a reference to it here on the body tag. Now, one of the cool things about UI Router is that we can specify within our state provider setup which controllers we want to be attached to which states. So let's just see an example of this here. If we come up here to our first state, let's put on it a controller. And let's say we want it to be state 1 controller. And so just for the sake of time, let's actually define the controller right here within the same file. So we'll come down here and say we want a new controller, and it's called state 1 controller. And we'll do our regular thing, give it a function with our scope injected, and let's maybe just put a message on there. We'll say scope.message is equal to hey from state 1. All right, so now what we can do is we can actually use this within our template up here. So instead of saying state 1 here, let's just template out our message. So there's our message property, which is on scope down here. And if everything is wired up properly, we should see this message now when we go to state 1. So back over here in the browser, we'll refresh and let's see what we get. If we go to state 1, here's our message, hey from state 1. So what I'd like to do now is kind of divert a bit from how we're used to using controllers. This is all familiar to us. We've used this a lot so far. We attach something to scope. In this case, it's just a string, and we can also attach methods and use those within our views as well. And we've been putting all of this stuff directly onto this scope object. Now this works, of course, and it's great for two-way data binding especially, but we run into problems when the applications we're building start to get larger. And there's a couple of different issues with using scope throughout the application when it becomes larger that are problematic, but a simple one to talk about is how our properties and our method names can kind of get confusing once we've got a lot of controllers at play. So as you can imagine, we'll probably have many different controllers within an application when it gets large, and it's quite likely that multiple controllers will have the same kinds of properties and methods. So in this case, a message would probably be something that we would have on multiple controllers. And other things that would go on scope, like methods such as maybe save or edit, those are kind of going to be similar between controllers in some cases as well. And so the problem we can run into is, let's just go over here to our view that we've got set up. Let's say we've got two controllers at work within the same view. So let's just shim this out. Let's do a div, and we'll say that on this one, we've got ng controller is equal to controller 1. And then we are going to just copy this, and we'll say this one is going to be controller 2. So of course, controller 1 is going to control anything within these div tags, and controller 2 is going to control anything within these tags. Now, like we said, we're probably in a lot of cases going to have similar things between controllers. So we could conceptually be trying to use message here and also message here. And so this can be a little bit problematic when we're looking at our views later, and it gets a bit confusing what exactly this message property here is for when we have the exact same thing here. Even though they're within different controllers, it's just a little bit more difficult to reason about than it should be. And so it would be great if we could do something that is more explicit. And if we could do something kind of like a dotted object notation, that would be a little bit easier to reason about. So it would be great if we could do something like controller1.message here, and then down here we would do something like controller2.message. And so then it becomes really clear which controllers these message properties here are attached to. And Angular provides a way for us to do this. And let's see how it works. We'll just get rid of all of this here. And let's go back over here to app.js. And so the way that we can fix this is by using the controller as syntax. And the controller as syntax works by first naming our controller and then saying as, and then giving it an alias. So in this case, let's say something like state1. And this alias now is going to be referencing our state 1 controller. And then what we need to do is come down here to our controller, and instead of using scope.message here, we need to bind our message to this. So our message now is bound to our controller, and we can come up here now in our template and make use of it by going state1 message there. So let's save that and make sure it still works. If we refresh, we see we still have our message coming through. So now to use anything from the controller, we have to append our alias to the front of it. So now let's take this just one step further, and instead of using this directly on our message, we are going to use what's called a capture variable. And the reason is that if we have, say, a method here in our controller, and we need to use the this keyword within it, let's say we had something like this, my method equals our function, and then we needed to use this within our method. Well, the this keyword is contextual and things can get confused between the two. So instead, let's use a capture variable. And what we need to do to use a capture variable is come over here and say var VM equals this. And we're using VM here. This is a popular one to use, and it just stands for view model. And so then instead of this .message, we say VM.message. And so now within the controller, we don't need to inject scope at all. We can get rid of it completely. And so this is a good way to avoid what's called scope soup in Angular. And scope soup can cause a lot of problems, especially as applications grow larger. The benefit here is that we are now explicit about which controllers are lining up with which properties in our templates.